something important. But I also recognize this is something familiar. The familiar part of it was research that I have been doing in ethnic studies, African American studies, Chicano studies, and that was the familiar part of it. But critical race theory, this is a polarizing filter. For those of you who are photographers, and you know that a polarizing filter does a number of things, but one of it saturates color. It brings out the color in a particular scene. But what it also does, have you ever been in a situation like in the back there, that window, that reflection off the mirror? We can't see what's on the other side of that mirror because of the reflection. The eye won't allow you to do that. But what a polarizing filter does on the front of a single lens reflex camera, you twist this ring right here, and you can see what the eye can't see. It takes the glare out, and you can see inside. Right? So it's an amazing tool for photographers. But as a researcher, a theory is a lens through which we observe and interpret social life. That's what theory is. As a sociologist, as a social scientist, that's how I use the tool of theory. It helps me interpret social phenomena. When I see something, a theory often comes to mind. How do I explain what I'm seeing? When I work with young people, as young as elementary school children, students, I ask them to interpret what they're seeing, and they're theorizing. Right? They're theorizing. There's some amazing theories that come out of the minds and mouths of young scholars in kindergarten through third grade. But a theory is a lens to which we observe and interpret social life. As you turn the lens, things become clear. I would argue that as you turn use a critical race lens, race and racism come into focus because they're central to the analysis, right? And I have to say this, is that in my work, I don't apologize for doing this work. I don't apologize for centering race and racism in the work that I do, right? That's not all that I do, because if you look at my working definition of critical race theory in education, I argue that critical race theory is the work of scholars, like many people in this room, who are attempting to develop an explanatory framework that accounts for the role of race and racism in education. See, I developed this definition for education scholars, because that's what I was working at the time. It's now used in other fields. It came from the law, but it's used in education, it's used in the humanities, it's used in the social sciences. But it's an important, what I think, a really important framework to use as we do this work, and works towards identifying and challenging racism. So there's this social justice element to critical race theory. It's just not about observing and interpreting. It's about engaging as part of a larger goal of identifying and challenging all forms of subordination. So race might get you to a place, but it can be about gender, class, sexuality, immigrant status, etc. So it's that intersection that critical race theory takes us to, by way of a racial focus, a race and racism focus. So that's my working definition of critical race theory in education.
Next is critical race theory foundations and beginnings with Zenaida.
So when we think about the beginning, we go back to the beginning of where critical race theory came from. The concept or the theory itself was developed out of a deep satisfaction that many Black legal scholars felt with the liberal civil rights discourse, when civil rights talking and discourse started. And they developed this theory on the premise of the ideas of assimilation, contour blindness, and integration. The emergence of the critical legal studies movement provided CRT theorists with an innovative language so that it allowed them to develop a critique of traditional race analysis and law in the United States. The earliest focus came from, it dates back to the theorist Bell, which started around 1976. There were other scholars involved in the focus of CRT, such as Freeman in 78, Crenshaw, Gapanda, Peller, Thomas in 1995, Shaw, Wesley, and Harris in 2000. So thereafter, after the year 2000, there was a whole plethora of scholars associated with CRT. And a multitude of the studies on critical race theory are related to education. So that in 1981, there was a group of law students at Harvard, led by Kimberly Crenshaw and Marie Matsuda, who organized an alternative course because they were not happy with the course on the critical race theory that the school was offering. And that class that they offered was taught by Bell as well. It was integrated in the on race within the law courses. So they actually put together a mini course that was then eventually offered by the administration of Harvard. When you think about the development and expansion of the critical race theory, we want to remember that it started with a body of the legal scholarship committed to the struggle against racism, particularly as institutionalized in and by law. So it started as a movement, really, a movement in law that quickly grew to a focus on the educational institutions, like I said earlier. And it's actually applied to education. It assumes that inequalities exist between the schooling experiences of white middle-class students and African American and Latinx students. There's a relationship among race, racism, and power, which gave rise to intersectionality within the critical race theory. And the discourse reached a broad perspective of economics, history context, group, and self-interest, feelings, and the unconscious. The critical race theory is characterized by frequent use of first person, storytelling, narrative, allegory, interdisciplinary treatment of the law, and unapologetic use of creativity. Taking a look at the foundations of CRT, CRT highlights the broad structures and systems perpetuating inequality and justice, as those that I mentioned in just a few seconds ago. First, they serve as an analytical tool for understanding inequity in a racialized society. CRT aims to identify race and racism, specifically in educational and other institutions. It provides a lens to focus on racism in education in the U.S. and international context. CRT challenges the lexicon and practices of racism within systemic issues, and it refers to and involves activism. Two of the key ideas of CRT: one, political race, race reframed to denote social vocation and political commitment. As well, there is magical realism, which refers to the creativity to imagine how racism can be enacted in new, non-predictable ways to invoke questions and to reframe and experiment to build allies and coalitions against racism.
Next, we're going to get into CRT scholars with Jeff.
We want you to be familiar with some of the most important people, past and present, in the world of critical race theory. Next to each person's name is one of the most significant pieces of their work. To say that it is their most important work would be up for debate. So if you're interested in supplementing your learning for this class, consider looking for some of these titles. Derek Bell is credited as being the founder of CRT, and for that reason, one of the other presenters is going to tell you more about him. In my opinion, he has a great demeanor, and if you have the opportunity, you should watch some of the interviews that are available. One of the coolest things that Derek Bell ever did, in the early 90s, Bell protested the lack of diversity at Harvard Law, taking an extended leave of absence until they agreed to hire an African-American woman. Patricia Williams is a lawyer who graduated from Harvard Law in 1975. She writes a column for The Nation magazine titled Diary of a Mad Law Professor, and has published numerous articles. Richard Delgado literally wrote the book Critical Race Theory. He graduated from UC Berkeley School of Law. He's written numerous books and journal articles. And at the age of 80, he is still teaching civil rights at University of Alabama School of Law. He taught at the alternative course in 1981. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is considered to be one of the founders of critical race theory, as she helped organize the alternative course in 1981. Her credentials are impressive. Her work has had significant influence around the world. She's a talented speaker, author, scholar, lawyer, and more. She developed the theory of intersectionality, and she is also a graduate of Harvard Law. Kamara Phyllis Jones is unique in that she is not a lawyer, but a physician. She also has very impressive credentials, graduating from Stanford Medical. A lot of her work is focused on the effects of racism and social inequalities on personal health. Mari Matsuda was the first tenured Asian American law professor in the United States while she was at UCLA. She's been a civil rights activist all of her career. She's written some very important pieces on reparations and affirmative action. She was at the original alternative course in 1981 as a graduate law student. Daniel Solorzano, who you saw in the video, is a sociologist. He earned a PhD from Claremont Graduate School in 1986. The number of articles that he has published and books that he has contributed is enormous. He has written extensively on microaggressions. He is currently the director of the Center for Critical Race Studies in Education at UCLA. Finally, we have Gloria Latson Billings, a teacher, educator, who has focused a lot of her energy highlighting the combination of historical, moral, socio-political, and economic factors that have disproportionately impacted non-white students. In many ways, she's the one responsible for turning the focus of CRT from law to schools.
Next, we're going to dig a little deeper with Derek Bell with Caroline.
So as Jeff mentioned, Derek Bell was a principal figure of critical race theory and even called the movement's intellectual father figure. He was born in 1930 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, served in the U.S. Air Force in Korea. He earned a BA in political studies of political science and his LLB from University of Pittsburgh in 1957. The NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund in 1960. He was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School in 1971. He became an author about current civil rights issues. He died of cancer in 2011 in New York. He's not not just changing a few customs, but requires altering the status of whites. Whites are uncomfortable with the fact that they will have to surrender some privileges that they enjoy. Argued that desegregation in the 1950s was motivated by potential economic and political advances in the world. And finally, anti-defiance inferior to creation of model black schools.
Next, we're going to get into the 6 tenets of critical race theory. Isabel's going to be doing the first 3 tenets.
So, as Lisa mentioned, there's 6 tenets of critical race theory, and educational leadership can learn and use to eliminate racism. So, permanence of racism, whiteness as property, counter-storytelling, and majoritarian narratives, interest conversions, critique of liberalism, and intersectionality. So I'll start with permanence of racism. So racism is both conscious and unconscious. Leaders can take 3 steps in helping reduce this permanence of racism. The first step is we have to accept that racism exists. Taking it a step further, I can be racist. I am racist. I'm going to give you an example. Real life happened to me. A few months ago, my daughter came home with an after-school flyer, one of those programs. I read African American Parent Educator Advisory Committee. I put it to the side, continued washing dishes. She came back and said, "Mom, why haven't you filled it out?" Never in my mind did I think she wanted to join this. So she said, it's going to have really cool lessons. And at the end of it, I get to perform and I'm going to learn so much about African American history that I don't get to learn in my classroom. Learned a lot from my kid that day. She ended up being Harriet Tubman, one of the lead roles, absolutely loved it. And I think as a family, we all learned a lesson about just because I read African American doesn't mean I can't include my child. Like I said, she was super excited to participate with her. So identifying was the first step, accepting. So now I want to develop an anti-racist identity. With here, leaders have to be committed. It's a lifelong commitment. Work on our racist assumptions and beliefs. And this can be done through professional development, reading, media, really relationships that we build with others. Now that we have all of this strength, now that we've done all of this work, let's be a model. That's the next step. So creating those concrete goals, implementing those plans, and most importantly, staying active so that permanence of racism can go away. Next slide. So the next one is whiteness as property. And here I'm just going to give you an example. Most of us own a home, and we know about property values. And because public school finance is based on local property taxes, wealthier communities are able to allocate more funding to education than economically poor communities. There's whiteness as property. Paper in his article gave an example of a high school that only offered AP classes in the morning. This excluded those students that were bused in from those lower socioeconomic areas. Now, the teachers didn't see a big deal. They were getting paid for being there early. But at the end of the day, how many students were excluded? I know when I was in high school, I got to take those classes. I wasn't excluded from it. Next slide. Tenet 3 is counter-storytelling and majoritarian narratives. So whites use majoritarian narratives to justify, legitimize, and help maintain the status quo of these racial inequities. These narratives are embedded with racialized omissions, distortions, and stereotypes. Here's an example. Some whites may explain racial inequities exist because African Americans and Latino students they don't value education, or based on their cultural difference or all of their deficiencies, they can't possibly succeed. This leads to deficit thinking and blaming the victim. So in my last slide, I place 4 majoritarian narratives of privilege. Next slide. Here, you may read these and notice that maybe you've heard these before. And take it away, Lisa.
So the next tenets 4 through 6, I'll be reviewing, starting with the interest conversion. So the idea of this tenet is that any gains toward racial equality have only happened and can only happen when whites benefit. So when our interests between white and people of color come together, that is when the pursuit or the advancement of racial equality and equity occur. So that's the premise of this tenet. An example of this is Brown versus Board of Education. So the idea that there is a consciousness about the benefit of whites by increasing a positive stature of the United States during the Cold War. So this idea that we had a bad look as the United States with the discrepancies of how students were treated, there was a benefit of Brown versus Board of Education decision. On a more personal note, in my district, and I notice in districts across the way, that there have been an increase in equity departments, an equity director, an equity assistant soup. This is because of the pushback and backlash of the inequities of people of color. So in order to look better, or in order to deem that we are going to address these concerns, the development of these positions have come about. The good part is that more students of color are having more scrutiny about the practices and policies that benefit them. So in this regard, our interests definitely converge. The next tenet is the critique of liberalism. And I'm sure we've all heard this. I don't see color. I treat students the same. A student's race doesn't matter to me. Well, when you have this color blindness, it can be detrimental to the students of color, and it perpetuates racial oppression, and it increases this expectation of assimilation at the expense of one's cultural identity. And it ignores the brutality of what has happened to people of color, and it doesn't take into account the systematic oppression that comes with one's race. So by not seeing color, you're not seeing the whole person or the whole student. The sixth tenet is intersectionality. And this is what was referred to in the video and what my colleagues have referred to previously. It's the sixth tenet, and it's considered crucial. It's a concept that addresses the question of how multiple forms of inequality and identity interrelate, but at different times and over different contexts. So the term was first introduced in 1995 by critical race theory Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was mentioned as one of our key scholars. And intersectionality is a concept that by belonging to a particular group can make people vulnerable in different forms of bias. Yet because we are also members of other groups, our complex identities can shape the specific way we each experience that bias. So when you're a Latina female person who maybe has a disability, you know, there's intersectionality in that. If you're a white gay man, you know, there's intersectionality in that. So we all are made up of these complex beings, and different portions of us do experience certain biases, and it's the intersection of these biases that we take a look at these things. And that sums up our presentation. So on behalf of Isabel, Jeff, Caroline, myself, and Zenaida, thank you.